Welcome to Café Stories. I'm Alfie, your host for today's mystery. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let us know in the comments. Today's mystery, the Forbidden Fruit Tart Formula, a brand new Miss Marple adventure that will keep you guessing until the very last page. Miss Marple and the Forbidden Fruit Tart Formula. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Recipe. St. Mary Mead's annual Fruit Harvest Festival had always been a source of modest pride for the village. The late September celebration, with its displays of glistening preserves and artfully arranged produce, provided a welcome diversion from the approaching autumn chill. Miss Jane Marple, having lived in the village for all of her considerable years, had attended more such gatherings than she cared to count. Yet this year's festival held a particular significance that had drawn an unusually large crowd to the village hall. Mr. Aldridge, the village baker, whose establishment had stood on the high street for nearly 30 years, was to be featured in The Epicurean, a prestigious London food magazine. His famous fruit tart, with its perfectly balanced sweetness and inexplicably light pastry, had somehow caught the attention of the magazine's editor during a chance visit to the area. The recipe, guarded with a secrecy that Miss Marple found rather amusing for a simple tart, was to be revealed in a special display before being published in the magazine's autumn issue. "One would think he was guarding the crown jewels," Miss Marple remarked to her friend Dolly Bantry, as they surveyed the glass case where the handwritten recipe was to be displayed at precisely 3 o'clock. "But then I suppose we all have our little secrets." "Well, it is rather special," said Mrs. Bantry, adjusting her hat. "Arthur has always said he'd give anything to know how Aldridge manages that pastry. It simply melts in one's mouth." Miss Marple nodded, her pale blue eyes drifting across the decorated hall. "Yes, indeed, though I've always thought there was something of Mrs. Littleton's technique in it. She cooked at the manor house when I was a girl, you know. She had a way with pastry that was quite remarkable." The hall buzzed with excitement. Trestle tables lined the walls, laden with the village's offerings. Mrs. Ellington's damson preserve, which had taken first prize 3 years running, Colonel Bantry's apples, arranged in a pyramid of red and green, and Mrs. Harmon's pumpkins, their orange skins gleaming under the hall's lights. Near the front, Mr. Aldridge himself stood proudly by the empty display case, a robust man with florid cheeks and flour perpetually embedded in the creases of his hands. His white baker's jacket had been pressed for the occasion, though it strained slightly across his ample midsection. But it was not Mr. Aldridge who caught Miss Marple's attention. Rather, it was the tall, elegant figure of Lady Penelope Witherspoon, standing somewhat apart from the crowd, her aristocratic features set in an expression of barely concealed distaste. At 72, Lady Penelope remained a striking woman, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her bearing as straight as it had been in her youth. "Lady Penelope doesn't seem to be enjoying herself," observed Miss Marple quietly. "One would think she might stay away if she finds these gatherings so tedious." Mrs. Bantry followed her gaze. "Oh, she comes every year, though heaven knows why. I suppose it's expected, with Thornfield Estate being the largest property in the area. But look there! Isn't that Edward Witherspoon with the vicar?" Miss Marple turned, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the lean, dark-haired man engaged in conversation with the Reverend Clement. "So it is. How very interesting. I hadn't heard he was back in the village." "Returned just last week, apparently," Mrs. Bantry supplied, lowering her voice. "After 15 years in Africa or India, or somewhere equally foreign. There was quite a falling out with Lady Penelope before he left, though no one seems to know the details." "Huh," murmured Miss Marple, noting the way Edward Witherspoon's gaze kept returning to his aunt, though Lady Penelope seemed determined not to acknowledge his presence. "Human nature remains remarkably consistent, doesn't it? It reminds me rather of young Tommy Jenkins, who quarrelled with his grandmother over the inheritance of a modest fishing boat. Such bitter feelings over something that in the grand scheme of things hardly seems worth the discord. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a photographer from the Epicurean, a brisk London man with an air of impatience about him. Mr. Aldridge immediately straightened, smoothing his jacket and glancing at his pocket watch. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the vicar, clapping his hands for attention, "the moment has arrived. Mr. Aldridge will now place his famous fruit tart recipe in the display case for all to admire before it is whisked away to London for publication." A hush fell over the crowd. Mr. Aldridge reached into his inner pocket with a flourish, producing an envelope sealed with red wax. From this he carefully extracted a sheet of parchment covered in a flowing script. "My grandmother's recipe," he announced, his voice carrying a tremor of emotion, "perfected over 3 generations of Aldridges, and now to be shared with the world." He stepped forward to place the recipe in the glass case. As he did so, Miss Marple noticed Edward Witherspoon shift suddenly, his attention fixed on the parchment with an intensity that seemed out of place for a mere recipe. Equally curious was the way Lady Penelope's gloved hand tightened around her handbag. The recipe was placed in the case, the key turned with ceremony, and the photographer began arranging Mr. Aldridge beside his creation for the official photograph. It was then that the lights in the village hall flickered once, twice, and went out entirely. The darkness lasted only moments, but the ensuing confusion was considerable. When the lights returned, gasps rippled through the crowd. The glass case stood open, its contents vanished. "The recipe!" cried Mr. Aldridge, his face draining of colour. "It's gone!" Inspector Slack, who happened to be in attendance representing the local police, immediately took charge, ordering the doors locked and announcing that no one was to leave. "Theft!" he declared, his moustache quivering with indignation. "A most brazen act of theft, and in the presence of a police officer, no less." As the crowd murmured and shifted, Miss Marple remained still, her keen eyes noting the various reactions around the room. Lady Penelope's expression of distaste had deepened to one of alarm. Edward Witherspoon had moved closer to the exit, his face carefully neutral. And Mr. Aldridge, strangely enough, seemed to be casting anxious glances not at the empty case, but at the Witherspoons. "Most peculiar," Miss Marple said to herself, her fingers automatically reaching for the knitting needles in her bag. Most peculiar indeed. One would think it was far more than a recipe that had gone missing. The commotion swirled around her, but Miss Marple stood apart, her mind already connecting this incident to patterns she had observed over her many years in St. Mary Mead, where the theft of a recipe might conceal something of far greater significance than a secret method for making pastry. Chapter 2. Tea and Suspicions. 3 weeks had passed since the unfortunate incident at the Fruit Harvest Festival, yet the disappearance of Mr. Aldridge's recipe remained the primary topic of conversation in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple reflected on this as she arranged a plate of freshly baked scones on her best china. The theft had caused quite a stir, with Inspector Slack conducting a thorough but ultimately fruitless investigation. No culprit had been identified, and Mr. Aldridge had been forced to inform the Epicurean that his recipe would not be forthcoming after all. "Such a pity about poor Mr. Aldridge's recipe," said Mrs. Bantry, accepting the cup of tea Miss Marple offered. "I hear the magazine was most disappointed." It was Tuesday afternoon, the time Miss Marple traditionally set aside for her weekly tea gathering. The September weather had taken a turn, with rain pattering against the cottage windows, making the cosy sitting-room with its cheerful fire all the more inviting. "Yes, indeed," agreed Miss Weatherby, a thin, bird-like woman who taught piano to the village children. And have you noticed how altered Mr. Aldridge seems since? I purchased a loaf from him yesterday, and he scarcely seemed to know what he was about." Miss Marple passed the sugar bowl. "I observed something rather curious myself," she said mildly. "I happened to be returning from the vicarage quite late one evening. We had been sorting jumble for the church sale, you know, and I noticed a light in the bakery. It must have been nearly 11 o'clock. "Working late?" suggested Mrs. Price Ridley, helping herself to a scone. "Though what a baker would be doing at that hour, I cannot imagine. The bread is always prepared in the early hours, is it not?" "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "And what struck me as particularly odd was that it wasn't Mr. Aldridge alone. I distinctly saw Mr. Graves, Lady Penelope's solicitor, leaving the premises shortly after." This revelation caused a momentary pause in the clinking of teacups. "Mr. Graves?" echoed Mrs. Bantry. "Now that is strange. What business would Lady Penelope's solicitor have with the village baker at such an hour?" "Perhaps he has a sweet tooth," joked Mrs. Price Ridley, though no one laughed. "It reminds me, rather," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "of the case of old Mrs. Simmons and her gardener. You remember Dolly? The one who was always visiting at odd hours, and it transpired that Mrs. Simmons had been preparing a new will." "But surely Mr. Aldridge has no need of a solicitor," protested Miss Weatherby. "He's a simple baker, not a man of property or means." "One never knows," murmured Miss Marple, her needles beginning to click as she took up her knitting. "People are often not what they seem." The conversation shifted to other village matters: the vicar's upcoming sermon, the Women's Institute flower arrangement competition, and the new doctor's modern ideas about diet. Yet Miss Marple's mind remained occupied with the curious nocturnal meeting at the bakery. "Did you know," said Mrs. Bantry, helping herself to another cup of tea, "that Edward Witherspoon has taken rooms at the Blue Boar? It seems he intends to stay in the village for some time." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "I had assumed his visit would be brief, given the, shall we say, coolness between him and Lady Penelope." "Oh, there's more than coolness there," Mrs. Price Ridley said with relish. "My Martha, who does the cleaning at the Blue Boar twice weekly, says he's been most forthcoming about his grievances. Apparently, Lady Penelope all but turned him out 15 years ago, though he refuses to say why." "How very unfortunate," said Miss Marple. "Family disputes can be so distressing." "Martha also mentioned," continued Mrs. Price Ridley, lowering her voice confidentially, "that she overheard a most heated exchange between Edward Witherspoon and Mr. Aldridge in the village square just yesterday. Something about rightful claims and proof. Mr. Aldridge became quite red in the face, I gather." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. "How very interesting," she said. "One cannot help but wonder what connection there might be between our baker and the Witherspoon family." "None that I can imagine," said Mrs. Bantry decisively, "though Edward was always a difficult boy even before he left. Do you remember how he used to sneak into the manor house orchards to steal apples? Arthur caught him more than once." "Yes, I recall," nodded Miss Marple. "Though in fairness, many boys go through such phases. It puts me in mind of young Tommy Wilkins, who was forever taking things that didn't belong to him. It turned out he was simply desperate for attention after his parents' difficult divorce. The Wilkins inheritance dispute was quite the scandal 20 years ago, wasn't it?" The ladies murmured in agreement, memories of that long-ago village drama surfacing. "Speaking of inheritances," said Miss Weatherby, "did you hear that Lady Penelope has been in rather poor health lately? Dr. Haydock has been called to Thornfield Estate twice this week alone." This piece of information caused another ripple of interest among the gathered ladies. Lady Penelope, despite her advancing years, had always enjoyed robust health. Perhaps the shock of the festival incident, suggested Mrs. Bantry, or possibly the unexpected return of her nephew. Either might be enough to upset someone of her temperament. Perhaps, agreed Miss Marple, though her expression suggested she was considering other possibilities. By the way, Mrs. Price Ridley, did your Martha happen to mention what Mr. Aldridge said in response to Edward Witherspoon during their disagreement? Mrs. Price Ridley looked pleased to be asked. Indeed she did. Apparently he said something rather cryptic about the proof being in the pudding, or words to that effect. Martha thought he might have been referring to his baking. How curious, said Miss Marple, her pale blue eyes thoughtful as she resumed her knitting. The proof being in the pudding, or perhaps in the tart? The rain continued to drum against the windows as the afternoon wore on. When her guests had finally departed, Miss Marple stood at her cottage door, watching Mrs. Bantry navigate the puddled garden path under her umbrella. Something about this business with the recipe troubled her. It was like one of her knitting patterns where a stitch had been dropped several rows back, a small detail easily overlooked, yet causing the entire design to unravel if not properly addressed. She closed the door against the damp evening air and returned to her sitting room. The parallel to the Wilkins inheritance case had occurred to her during the conversation, but she hadn't fully explored the connection. In that instance, a missing letter had contained crucial information about the rightful heir to a modest fortune. Could Mr. Aldridge's recipe similarly contain information beyond mere baking instructions? Miss Marple settled back into her armchair, picked up her knitting, and allowed her mind to follow the threads of possibility. Outside the rain fell steadily, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, secrets that had lain dormant for years were stirring, threatening to rise to the surface like long-buried bones emerging from disturbed earth. Chapter 3. A Fatal Morning. Miss Marple was always an early riser, a habit formed in her youth and maintained throughout her long life. The morning light was just beginning to filter through her bedroom curtains when she heard the unmistakable sound of urgent footsteps passing her garden gate, followed by the commotion of voices raised in alarm. Sitting up in bed, she reached for her dressing gown and moved to the window, drawing back the curtain just enough to observe the street below. Young Fred Timmins, the butcher's boy, was running past, his face pale with excitement. Behind him came Constable Peters, moving with surprising speed for a man of his bulk. Something had clearly happened, and in a village like St. Mary Mead, unpleasant news travelled swiftly. Within the hour, while Miss Marple was still at her breakfast, the telephone rang. It was Dolly Bantry, her voice thick with shock. "Jane, have you heard? It's Mr. Aldridge. He's been found dead in his bakery." Miss Marple's hand tightened slightly on the receiver. "Dear me," she said, "how very dreadful. What happened?" "They're saying it was some sort of attack, an allergic reaction, Dr. Haydock thinks. Something to do with almond extract. He was discovered by his assistant, that young girl, Flora Bennett, when she arrived to begin the morning baking." Miss Marple absorbed this information in silence, her mind already making connections. "Most unfortunate," she said at last. "I believe I shall walk into the village later. One feels one should express condolences, even if one can do little else." After finishing her breakfast with her usual methodical calm, Miss Marple dressed with care in her second-best grey suit and set out for the High Street. The village was alive with speculation. Small groups of people gathered at corners, speaking in hushed but animated tones. The bakery itself was closed, a hastily written sign on the door announcing "due to unforeseen circumstances" as the reason. As Miss Marple approached, she observed Inspector Slack emerging from the premises, his face set in its usual expression of grim determination. He caught sight of her and frowned slightly. "Good morning, Inspector." Miss Marple said pleasantly. "What a terrible business this is." "Indeed, Miss Marple," replied Slack with barely concealed impatience. "Though I'm afraid this is a matter for the police. Straightforward case of accidental death, it seems." "Oh." Miss Marple's mild blue eyes widened slightly. "One would have thought Mr. Aldridge, being a baker, would be most careful with his ingredients. Almonds can be so dangerous to those with sensitivities." Inspector Slack's moustache twitched. "Yes, well, accidents happen even to the most careful. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have reports to file." As the inspector strode away, Miss Marple noticed a slender figure hovering near the bakery's side entrance. It was Flora Bennet, Mr. Aldridge's assistant, a girl of perhaps 22 with a pale, pretty face now stained with tears. "Miss Bennet?" Miss Marple called softly, approaching the girl. "I'm so very sorry about Mr. Aldridge. What a shock it must have been for you." Flora nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "It was horrible, Miss Marple. I came in at 4, as usual, and found him lying there by the mixing table. There was an empty bottle of almond extract in his hand, and his face—" She broke off, shuddering. "Poor child," said Miss Marple sympathetically. "And the police? Have they been asking many questions?" "Not really," Flora replied. "Dr. Haydock said it was an allergic reaction, and Inspector Slack seems satisfied with that. But it's strange because Mr. Aldridge always said he couldn't abide almonds. He never used them in his baking." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "Indeed? How very curious. And yet he had almond extract in the bakery." Flora shook her head, her brow furrowed. "That's just it. I don't recall ever seeing almond extract in our supplies before. Mr. Aldridge was most particular about his ingredients, you see. Everything had its place." "I imagine he would be," murmured Miss Marple. "A baker needs to be precise. Tell me, Miss Bennet, will you be continuing with the bakery?" "For now, yes. Mr. Aldridge had no family that I know of, and he left instructions." Flora hesitated, then continued. "He told me once that if anything ever happened to him, I was to keep the bakery running. Said he'd left papers with his solicitor, but I never thought—" "No, of course not," said Miss Marple, gently. "No one ever does. By the way, do you happen to know who Mr. Aldridge's solicitor was?" "Mr. Graves, I believe," replied Flora. "He's been here several times in the past few weeks, usually after closing. They would talk in the back room." "I see," said Miss Marple, recalling the late-night meeting she had observed. "Well, I'm sure everything will be sorted out in due course. You're a capable young woman, and Mr. Aldridge clearly had great faith in you." Later that morning, Miss Marple happened to encounter Dr. Haydock as he was leaving the post office. The doctor, a tall, angular man with a weathered face, greeted her with his usual good-natured brusqueness. "Ah, Miss Marple, I suppose you've heard about poor Aldridge." "Yes, indeed," she replied. "Most distressing. An allergic reaction, I understand?" Dr. Haydock ran a hand through his greying hair. "That's the official cause, yes, though between ourselves, I've never seen a reaction quite like it. The symptoms were unusual, extremely rapid and severe." "And the almond extract? Was it perhaps contaminated in some way?" "Possibly," the doctor conceded. "The bottle was empty, clutched in his hand, as if he'd been holding it when the attack came on. Most peculiar, considering—" He broke off abruptly. "Considering?" prompted Miss Marple. "Well, I probably shouldn't say, but I've been treating Aldridge for years. Never known him to use almonds. Had quite a pronounced aversion to them, in fact." "So I've heard," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "And Inspector Slack is satisfied with accidental death?" Dr. Haydock shrugged. "No reason not to be, I suppose. No signs of struggle, door locked from the inside." Simply a case of a man accidentally exposing himself to a substance he was dangerously allergic to. But why would he do such a thing, knowing the risk? Mused Miss Marple. The doctor had no answer for that, and they parted shortly after. Miss Marple continued her walk through the village, her mind turning over the curious circumstances of Mr. Aldridge's death. An empty bottle of almond extract, a man known to avoid almonds, a door locked from the inside. It all seemed too neat, too carefully arranged. As she passed the churchyard, she noticed a solitary figure standing among the gravestones. It was Edward Witherspoon, his tall form unmistakable even at a distance. He appeared to be studying a particular headstone with great interest. Miss Marple adjusted her course slightly, her curiosity piqued. The church records, she recalled, went back several generations. Perhaps tomorrow she would pay a visit to the vicar under the pretense of discussing the flower arrangement for the upcoming harvest Thanksgiving service. There were connections here, she was certain. Threads that linked the missing recipe, Mr. Aldridge's unexpected death, and the return of Edward Witherspoon to St. Mary Mead after 15 years abroad. Miss Marple turned towards home, her step purposeful, despite her age. In her experience, coincidences were rare in matters of this nature. Far more likely was human design, the careful orchestration of events to conceal an unwelcome truth. Chapter 4. Garden Conversations. The morning following Mr. Aldridge's funeral was particularly fine, with the kind of gentle autumn sunshine that brings out the last brilliance of summer flowers before the frost takes them. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her habit, and was tending to her roses when she heard the garden gate creak open. Turning, secateurs in hand, she saw Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, coming up the path. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Clement cheerfully. "I hope I'm not disturbing you too early." "Not at all, my dear," replied Miss Marple, straightening up with the slight stiffness that accompanied most of her movements these days. "I was just dead-heading the late bloomers. One does like to keep the garden tidy, even as the season ends." Mrs. Clement, a practical woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a sensible tweed skirt, settled herself on the garden bench. "The service yesterday was well attended, wasn't it?" "Poor Mr. Aldridge, one never knows when one's time will come." "Indeed not," agreed Miss Marple, joining her on the bench. "Though I must say I was surprised to see Lady Penelope in attendance. I wouldn't have thought she frequented village funerals." "Oh, she doesn't usually," said Mrs. Clement, lowering her voice slightly, though there was no one else to hear. "But according to my husband, she insisted on coming. Said it was a matter of family responsibility, whatever that might mean." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes showed a flicker of interest. "Family responsibility? How very curious. I wasn't aware that Lady Penelope was related to Mr. Aldridge." "Nor was I," admitted Mrs. Clement, "though I did want to mention something that may be of interest. My husband told me that Mr. Aldridge had been visiting the parish records room quite frequently in the week before his death. Leonard, the vicar, you know, found him there late one afternoon poring over the old registers." "The parish records?" echoed Miss Marple thoughtfully. "How interesting. Did your husband happen to mention which records in particular had caught Mr. Aldridge's attention?" Mrs. Clement nodded. "The marriage registers from the 1890s, apparently. Leonard thought it odd, as Mr. Aldridge claimed to be researching his family history, but as far as anyone knows, the Aldridges didn't settle in St. Mary Mead until after the Great War." "Curiouser and curiouser," murmured Miss Marple, her fingers automatically moving, as though working invisible knitting needles. "One can't help but wonder what he might have been looking for." They chatted a while longer about the Women's Institute and the upcoming church bazaar, but Miss Marple's mind remained occupied with this new piece of information. After Mrs. Clement departed, she returned to her roses, finding the methodical work conducive to clear thinking. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't immediately notice the tall figure standing at her garden gate. It was only when a shadow fell across the flower bed that she looked up to see Edward Witherspoon watching her. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his hat politely. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Witherspoon," she replied, regarding him with interest. He was a handsome man, she thought, with the unmistakable Witherspoon features, the high forehead and aristocratic nose that had characterized the family for generations. "Would you care to come in? I was just about to take a break and have some tea." "That's very kind of you," he said, following her into the cottage. Once seated in her small but comfortable sitting room, with the tea tray between them, Miss Marple observed her visitor more closely. There was a tension about him, a restlessness in the way his fingers tapped against the arm of the chair. "It must be quite a change," she remarked, pouring the tea, "coming back to St. Mary Mead after so many years abroad." Edward Witherspoon smiled faintly. "Yes, though in some ways it hasn't changed at all. The same faces, the same cottages, the same prejudices." "Village memories can be long," agreed Miss Marple mildly, "though I always find it sad when families become estranged. It seems so unnecessary in most cases." He looked at her sharply, as though trying to discern how much she knew. "Sometimes estrangement is the only option, Miss Marple, especially when one has been misrepresented." "Oh dear, how distressing for you," she said sympathetically. "And now, with your return coinciding so unfortunately with poor Mr. Aldridge's death," Edward's expression became guarded. "Yes, unfortunate timing, though I barely knew the man." "Really?" Miss Marple's surprise seemed genuine. "I had heard you were seen having quite an animated conversation with him in the village square not long ago." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, quickly suppressed. "News travels fast in St. Mary Mead, I see. Yes, we did speak briefly. Professional matters, nothing of consequence." "Professional matters?" repeated Miss Marple, with innocent curiosity. "I wasn't aware that you and Mr. Aldridge shared a profession." "We didn't," he said shortly. "I merely wanted to inquire about something he might have come across in his research. I understand he had quite an interest in local family histories." "Ah, yes," nodded Miss Marple. "I believe he was looking into parish records shortly before his death. Such a wealth of information in those old registers, isn't there? Births, marriages, deaths, the whole tapestry of village life over the centuries." Edward set down his teacup with a slight clatter. "Indeed. Well, Miss Marple, thank you for the tea, but I should be going. I have an appointment with Mr. Graves this afternoon." "Mr. Graves? Lady Penelope's solicitor?" Miss Marple's expression remained placid, though her interest was piqued. "How convenient that he handles so many matters in the village." After Edward's departure, Miss Marple stood at her cottage window, watching his tall figure stride away down the lane. The conversation had been illuminating, not so much for what had been said as for what had been carefully avoided. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple was startled by the shrill ring of the telephone. It was Dolly Bantry, her voice pitched higher than usual with excitement. "Jane, you'll never believe it. Lady Penelope has called a solicitor from London. Not Mr. Graves, mind you, but someone new, and she's announced she's revising her will. Colonel Bantry heard it from old Simpson at the golf club, who heard it from his daughter who works as a maid at Thornfield Estate." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "And most unusual, I would have thought, given her reliance on Mr. Graves for all legal matters these past 30 years. "Exactly." Mrs. Bantry's voice held a note of triumph. "And there's more. She's invited Edward to dine at Thornfield tonight. The first time he's set foot in the house since that dreadful quarrel 15 years ago." After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple returned to her armchair and picked up her knitting. The stitches formed themselves automatically as her mind worked over the various threads of information now in her possession. The missing recipe, Mr. Aldridge's interest in old parish records, his mysterious death, Edward Witherspoon's return, and now Lady Penelope's sudden decision to revise her will. Something was stirring at Thornfield Estate, something that had its roots in the past, and somehow the humble baker Mr. Aldridge had possessed knowledge or evidence that made him dangerous to someone. The recipe, Miss Marple was increasingly convinced, had been merely a vehicle for some other information, something worth killing for. Outside her window, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across her garden. In the distance, she could just make out the chimneys of Thornfield Estate rising above the trees, solid and imposing, a testament to generations of wealth and privilege. And secrets, she thought. Every old house had its secrets. Chapter 5. The Baker's Secret. Miss Marple had always believed in establishing routines, finding that they often yielded unexpected dividends. Thus, in the days following Mr. Aldridge's funeral, she made a point of visiting the bakery each morning, ostensibly to purchase a small loaf or a few scones. The real purpose, of course, was to observe young Flora Bennet, who had taken over the running of the establishment with surprising efficiency. "Good morning, Miss Bennet," she said, entering the shop on a particularly brisk morning. The bell above the door jangled cheerfully, at odds with the sombre black armband Flora wore over her neat white uniform. "I trust you're managing? Such a responsibility for one so young." Flora looked up from arranging a tray of buns and offered a tired smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Yes, I'm coping, thank you. Mr. Aldridge trained me well, and I've been keeping to his methods exactly." "Very sensible," approved Miss Marple, glancing around the shop. It was empty at this early hour, giving her the opportunity she had been waiting for. "I imagine he left quite detailed instructions." "He struck me as a most methodical man." Flora nodded, brushing a strand of brown hair from her forehead. "Oh, he was. You've no idea. Everything had to be just so, his recipes, his accounts, even the arrangement of the storage room." "He kept records, then?" asked Miss Marple casually. "Many people in business are rather haphazard about such things." "Records?" Flora gave a small laugh. "He kept journals, dozens of them, dating back 30 years or more. He wrote in them every day, noting down not just recipes and business matters, but all sorts of things about the village and the people in it." Miss Marple's interest sharpened perceptibly. "How fascinating. Rather like a village historian, one might say." "I suppose so," agreed Flora, moving to fetch Miss Marple's usual order of scones. "Though some of it seems rather personal, almost like gossip, but written down, names and dates and little observations. I only glanced at them, of course," she added hastily. "They're private, really?" "Of course, my dear," soothed Miss Marple. "One wouldn't dream of prying." "Are they kept here in the bakery?" Flora nodded, wrapping the scones in paper. "In the back room, yes, in a locked cabinet. Mr. Graves came by yesterday to look at them. Said it was necessary for settling Mr. Aldridge's affairs." She frowned slightly. Though it was odd, he seemed most interested in one particular journal, from around 1895. Asked if he could take it away, but I refused. Mr. Aldridge was always very clear that his papers were to remain in the bakery. "How very conscientious of you," said Miss Marple approvingly. "Mr. Aldridge would have been pleased by your loyalty. By the way," she added, as if the thought had just occurred to her, "have you had any other visitors inquiring about Mr. Aldridge's papers? Mr. Edward Witherspoon, perhaps?" A flicker of surprise crossed Flora's face. "How did you know?" "He came by just yesterday afternoon, asking similar questions." Wanted to know if Mr. Aldridge had left any documents mentioning the Witherspoon family. I told him I hadn't looked through the journals properly and couldn't say." "Very wise," murmured Miss Marple. "One must be cautious in such matters." She paid for her scones and was about to leave when the shop bell jangled again. A tall, scholarly-looking man in spectacles entered, removing his hat to reveal thinning grey hair. "Good morning," he said, in a voice that immediately identified him as not from St. Mary Mead. "I'm looking for Miss Bennet. I'm Professor Hargreaves from King's College, London." Flora stepped forward. "I'm Flora Bennet." "Ah, excellent," said the professor, smiling pleasantly. "I understand the late Mr. Aldridge had an interest in local history. I am researching family lineages in this area, particularly the old families like the Witherspoons, and was told he might have some useful information." Miss Marple, who had paused by the door, watched this exchange with keen interest. Flora appeared hesitant. "Mr. Aldridge did keep some historical records," she admitted. "But as I was just explaining to Miss Marple, they're rather personal. I'm not sure I should—" "Oh, I quite understand," interrupted Professor Hargreaves smoothly. "Perhaps I could just ask a few questions? Over tea, perhaps? My research is focused specifically on the period around 1895, a fascinating time for the local gentry." Miss Marple noted that 1895 was the same year that had interested Mr. Graves, according to Flora. Sensing the young woman's discomfort, she intervened gently. "Professor Hargreaves, how fortunate that we've met. I'm Miss Jane Marple, and I've lived in St. Mary Mead all my life. My father was the vicar here for 40 years, and I recall many stories about the old families. Perhaps I might be of assistance?" The professor turned to her with barely concealed impatience. "Thank you, ma'am, but I'm particularly interested in documentary evidence. Diaries, letters, parish records, that sort of thing." "I see," said Miss Marple mildly. "Like the parish records Mr. Aldridge was consulting before his death, the marriage registers from the 1890s, I believe." This caught the professor's attention. "Indeed. Do you know what specifically he was researching?" "I couldn't say for certain," replied Miss Marple, "though the vicar's wife did mention he seemed most interested in the marriages from 1895. Something flickered in Professor Hargreaves's eyes, a momentary calculation, quickly concealed. "Most interesting. Well, I mustn't keep you ladies. Miss Bennet, perhaps we could arrange that tea later this afternoon, say 4 o'clock? After the professor had departed, Flora turned to Miss Marple with a troubled expression. "I don't know what to do, Miss Marple. Everyone seems so interested in Mr. Aldridge's journals suddenly, especially that one from 1895. But Mr. Aldridge was always so protective of them." "Trust your instincts, my dear," advised Miss Marple. "Mr. Aldridge valued your discretion, I'm sure. By the way, did Mr. Aldridge ever mention to you anything about the recipe that was stolen from the festival? The famous fruit tart?" Flora shook her head. "Only that it was very old and had been in his family for generations. He was terribly upset when it disappeared, said it was irreplaceable." She paused, remembering something. Though now I think of it, he did say something rather odd the day before he died. He said, "The recipe isn't just about making tarts, Flora. It's about making things right." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "Making things right? Those were his exact words?" "Yes," confirmed Flora. "I didn't understand what he meant at the time." Later that day, as dusk was falling, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, carefully reviewing her notes. The connections were beginning to form a pattern. Mr. Aldridge's interest in the parish marriage records from 1895, the stolen recipe described as irreplaceable, and the strange coincidence of Mr. Aldridge's death occurring just as Edward Witherspoon returned to the village after 15 years. She remembered something Flora had mentioned about the journals, that they contained not just recipes and business matters, but observations about the village and its inhabitants. Like a historian, she had said. Or perhaps, thought Miss Marple, like someone who collected secrets. And secrets, as Miss Marple knew all too well from her many years in St. Mary Mead, could be deadly when suddenly exposed to the light after long concealment. Like certain plants that thrived in darkness and withered in the sun, some truths were best left buried. Yet sometimes, she reflected, watching the last light fade from her garden, truth had a way of surfacing despite all efforts to suppress it. And when it did, the consequences could be far-reaching indeed, especially for those with much to lose. Chapter 6. Threads Unravelling. The memorial service for Mr. Aldridge was held at St. Mary Mead's parish church on a day when the autumn sky seemed unable to decide between sunshine and showers. Miss Marple arrived early, as was her custom, dressed in respectful black and carrying her knitting bag. She selected a pew near the back, which afforded an excellent view of the congregation as it assembled. The village had turned out in full force, for Mr. Aldridge had been well liked, his bread and pastries having sustained the community for 3 decades. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she watched the mourners file in. Shopkeepers from the high street, regular customers, and, most interestingly, Lady Penelope Witherspoon, accompanied not by her nephew, but by Mr. Graves, her solicitor. "Good morning, Miss Marple," whispered Mrs. Bantry, slipping into the pew beside her. "What a turnout! I don't believe I've ever seen Lady Penelope at a village funeral before this one." "No, indeed," murmured Miss Marple, her fingers never ceasing their rhythmic work. "Most unusual. And notice how tense she appears, not merely sad, but almost watchful." Mrs. Bantry nodded. "And Mr. Graves seems positively grim. Oh, and there's Edward Witherspoon just coming in now. My goodness, he's chosen to sit quite apart from his aunt, hasn't he?" Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in the scene. Edward Witherspoon, tall and distinguished in his dark suit, deliberately selecting a pew on the opposite side of the church from Lady Penelope. As he sat down, his gaze briefly met his aunt's across the aisle. Something unspoken passed between them, a challenge perhaps, or a warning. The service proceeded with the vicar's measured tones rising and falling in familiar cadences of comfort and remembrance. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their soft clicking, a counterpoint to the hymns and prayers. She observed how, during the eulogy, Mr. Graves leaned over to whisper something to Lady Penelope. Whatever he said caused the older woman to stiffen visibly, her gloved hands clutching her prayer book more tightly. After the service, the congregation moved to the church hall for refreshments. Miss Marple positioned herself near a corner table where she could observe while appearing to focus on her knitting. Flora Bennet was moving among the guests, accepting condolences with quiet dignity. Professor Hargreaves had also attended and was now engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Edward Witherspoon near the punch bowl. "Quite the gathering of interested parties," remarked Miss Marple softly to herself. She watched as Mr. Graves approached Flora, speaking to her with what seemed to be some urgency. The young woman shook her head firmly, and the solicitor's expression darkened momentarily before he composed himself. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage on the pretext of discussing arrangements for the upcoming harvest festival. The Reverend Clement welcomed her into his study, a cosy room lined with theological texts and parish records. "Ah, Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. Mrs. Clement mentioned you might be stopping by. About the flower arrangements, I believe?" "Yes, indeed," smiled Miss Marple. "Though I confess I had another small matter I wanted to discuss. I understand Mr. Aldridge was researching in your parish records shortly before his death." The vicar nodded, removing his spectacles to polish them thoughtfully. Yes, he's spent several afternoons here. Most interested in the marriage registers from the 1890s. I didn't think much of it at the time. Many people develop an interest in genealogy in their later years. Did he happen to mention what he was looking for specifically? Inquired Miss Marple. Not in so many words, replied the vicar. Though I did notice he was particularly focused on entries from 1895. In fact, he added, frowning slightly, I discovered something rather odd after he'd gone. One of the pages in the register appeared to have been torn. Not recently, you understand, but many years ago. When I mentioned this to Mr. Aldridge on his next visit, he seemed unsurprised, almost as if he'd expected it. How very interesting, murmured Miss Marple. And this torn page, it would have contained records from what period exactly? June 1895, said the vicar. A shame, really. Historical records should be preserved intact. After leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple took a circuitous route home that led her past the extensive grounds of Thornfield Estate. The gardens were renowned throughout the county, though rarely open to visitors due to Lady Penelope's preference for privacy. As she paused to admire the distant view of the rose terrace, she noticed an elderly man pruning some shrubs near the perimeter wall. "Good afternoon," she called pleasantly. "The dahlias are particularly fine this year, aren't they?" The old gardener straightened up with a slight wince, one hand pressed to the small of his back. "Aye, that they are, miss. Last good showing before the frost takes 'em, I reckon." Miss Marple noticed his gnarled hands, testimony to decades of working the soil. "You must have been at Thornfield for many years," she said, conversationally. "Man and boy," he nodded. 62 years come Michaelmas. Started under old Lord Witherspoon, I did, before the current lady took over." 62 years? Marvelled Miss Marple. "You must have seen many changes." "Some things change, some don't," he said philosophically. "The gardens grow and die back and grow again. The family has its ups and downs. Nature and human nature both follow their patterns, don't they?" "Indeed they do," agreed Miss Marple. "I imagine you knew Lady Penelope when she was quite young then." Something flickered in the old man's eyes, a memory perhaps, or a caution. "I knew them all," he said carefully. "The old lord, Lady Penelope, her sister who died young. Sad business that was." "A sister?" Miss Marple's interest quickened. "I don't believe I've heard mention of a sister." The gardener looked suddenly wary. "It was a long time ago, before the scandal with the kitchen girl even. Not something that's talked about much at Thornfield." "Kitchen girl?" prompted Miss Marple, gently. The old man seemed to realize he had said too much. "Never mind an old man's ramblings," he said, turning back to his pruning. "That's all water under the bridge now, 60 years or more." Miss Marple noted the time frame with interest. "Around 1895, perhaps?" The gardener didn't answer, but the momentary stillness of his pruning shears was confirmation enough. Walking home, Miss Marple's mind worked over this new information. A scandal involving a kitchen girl at Thornfield Estate around 1895. A torn page in the parish marriage register from June of that same year. Mr. Aldridge's intense interest in that specific period. And now the convergence of interested parties, Lady Penelope, Edward Witherspoon, Mr. Graves, and the mysterious Professor Hargreaves, all seemingly concerned with the baker's journals and the missing recipe. The recipe that, according to Flora, Mr. Aldridge had cryptically described as not just about making tarts, but about making things right. As Miss Marple approached her cottage, the evening shadows lengthening across her garden path, she felt the familiar sensation of puzzle pieces beginning to align. Not a complete picture yet, but the edges were forming, creating a framework within which the central truth might be discerned. She thought of the torn page in the marriage register, of old scandals and hidden journals, of a recipe that had vanished, and a baker who had died with an empty bottle of almond extract in his hand. Someone was willing to go to great lengths to keep the past buried. But, as Miss Marple knew from her long experience of village life, buried secrets had a way of working themselves to the surface, like stones in a ploughed field, rising anew with each frost. Chapter 7. The Missing Ingredient. Miss Marple was enjoying a quiet morning with her knitting when she heard the unmistakable sound of Inspector Slack's motor car pulling up outside her cottage. Setting aside her work, she rose to answer the door just as the inspector raised his hand to knock. "Good morning, Inspector," she said mildly. "What a pleasant surprise." Inspector Slack, who found nothing pleasant in the necessity of consulting with elderly village ladies, however shrewd, gave a curt nod. "Miss Marple, may I come in? There have been developments in the Aldridge case." "Developments?" She ushered him into her sitting room. "I was under the impression that you had concluded it was an accidental death." The inspector shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, new evidence has come to light. The laboratory results on that bottle of almond extract found in Mr. Aldridge's hand have finally come back. It wasn't just almond extract. It contained a significant concentration of cyanide." "Cyanide?" echoed Miss Marple, though she didn't appear particularly surprised. "Dear me, that does rather change things, doesn't it?" "It means we're looking at murder, not accident," stated Slack bluntly. "And given your familiarity with the victim and the village, I thought it prudent to ask if you've observed anything unusual recently. Any tensions or disputes involving Mr. Aldridge?" Miss Marple considered this for a moment. "There was the matter of the stolen recipe, of course. Mr. Aldridge was quite distressed about that." "A recipe hardly seems worth killing over," scoffed the inspector. "Perhaps not," agreed Miss Marple, "unless it contained something beyond baking instructions, something valuable or compromising to someone." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Go on." "I couldn't say for certain," Miss Marple demurred. "But Mr. Aldridge had been researching old parish records shortly before his death, marriage registers from 1895 to be precise, and I understand he kept detailed journals about village affairs going back some 30 years. The inspector made a note in his pocketbook. "I'll need to examine those journals. Where are they kept?" "At the bakery, I believe." "Under Miss Bennet's care now. Though I understand several people have already expressed interest in them, Mr. Graves, Lady Penelope's solicitor, Edward Witherspoon, and a Professor Hargreaves from London, who claims to be researching local family histories." Slack's frown deepened. "All circling like vultures, are they?" "Interesting." He rose to leave. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I'll be looking into this further." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple telephoned Dolly Bantry and invited her to tea that afternoon. When her friend arrived, Miss Marple was already setting out the tea tray with her usual precision. "You sounded quite mysterious on the telephone, Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, settling into her usual chair. "Has something happened?" "Inspector Slack paid me a visit this morning," replied Miss Marple, pouring the tea. "It seems Mr. Aldridge was murdered after all, poisoned with cyanide in what appeared to be a bottle of almond extract." "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mrs. Bantry. "Murder in St. Mary Mead again. But who would want to kill a baker?" "Someone who feared what he knew," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "It reminds me rather of the case of older Mrs. Ellington and her companion, Miss Waters. Do you recall? 30 years ago now." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Vaguely. Wasn't there some question about a changed recipe in that case as well?" "Indeed there was," nodded Miss Marple. "Mrs. Ellington's famous blackberry cordial recipe had been altered to disguise the taste of the digitalis her companion was administering. But what was most interesting was that the original recipe contained coded information about Mrs. Ellington's will, a clue to where she had hidden her true testament after becoming suspicious of Miss Waters' intentions. "You think Mr. Aldridge's recipe contained some sort of code?" "It seems likely," said Miss Marple. "Given what Flora Bennet told me about his last words, that the recipe wasn't just about making tarts, but about making things right. And considering his research into the parish marriage records from 1895, the same year the old gardener at Thornfield mentioned a scandal involving a kitchen girl." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Jane, do you think the recipe might contain proof of some sort of irregular union? Perhaps between a member of the Witherspoon family and a servant?" "It would explain a great many things," mused Miss Marple. Edward Witherspoon's sudden return after 15 years, Lady Penelope's unusual interest in Mr. Aldridge's funeral, the stolen recipe, and now murder. After Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple decided to pay one more visit to the bakery. The afternoon was waning, and the high street was quiet as she made her way to the shop. The bell jangled as she entered, finding Flora cleaning up for the day. "Miss Marple?" The young woman greeted her warmly. "I've just taken a batch of lemon buns from the oven. Would you care for one?" "How kind, my dear, but no. I was wondering if I might see Mr. Aldridge's recipe books. Inspector Slack mentioned he would be coming to examine them, and I thought perhaps I could help identify anything that might be relevant." Flora hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I suppose it's all right. Mr. Aldridge always spoke highly of you. They're in the back room, in the cabinet." The back room of the bakery was warm and fragrant with the scents of fresh bread and pastry. A large wooden cabinet stood against one wall, its doors unlocked now as Flora led Miss Marple to it. "Here they are," she said, indicating several rows of leather-bound journals and notebooks, all dated and organized by year. Miss Marple examined the shelf with interest. "So methodical," she murmured. "And all in his own hand, I presume?" "Oh, yes," confirmed Flora. "Mr. Aldridge didn't trust typewriters or secretaries. Said the only way to keep a proper record was to write it yourself." As Miss Marple scanned the shelves, she noticed something curious about the arrangement. While most of the volumes were grouped chronologically, a few had been placed according to a different system altogether, separated from their sequential neighbours and positioned with seemingly unrelated years. "How odd," she remarked. "These appear to be out of order." Flora peered at the shelf. "That's strange. Mr. Aldridge was always so particular about their arrangement. I haven't touched them since his death." Miss Marple carefully removed one of the misplaced volumes, a journal from 1909, that had been shelved between books from 1924 and 1930. As she opened it, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. Bending with some difficulty, she retrieved it, a faded photograph of a young woman in a maid's uniform, her expression serious but her eyes bright with youth and intelligence. "Who is this, I wonder?" Miss Marple mused, showing the photograph to Flora. "I've never seen her before," said Flora, examining the image. "Though wait, there's something written on the back." Miss Marple turned the photograph over. In faded ink was written, "Mary Briggs, kitchen maid, Thornfield Estate, 1894. As Flora returned to the front of the shop to serve a late customer, Miss Marple continued her examination of the journals. The pattern of misplacement now seemed deliberate rather than accidental, a code of sorts. Following her instinct, she carefully removed each out-of-place volume and leafed through it. In the final misplaced journal, tucked between its pages, she found a folded document, part of a birth certificate, yellowed with age, the bottom portion torn away. The name of the child was clearly visible, Catherine Mary, born June 14th, 1895. The father's name had been obscured, but the first letter W was still discernible. Miss Marple returned everything to its place, her mind working rapidly. June 1895, the same month as the torn page in the parish marriage register. A kitchen maid named Mary Briggs from Thornfield Estate. A birth certificate with the father's name beginning with W. That evening, as Miss Marple was returning from visiting the vicarage, she found her cottage had been disturbed. Nothing appeared to be missing, but her papers had been searched and the cushions of her armchair turned over. Someone had been looking for something, perhaps the very clues she had discovered that afternoon in Mr. Aldridge's cabinet. Standing in her disordered sitting-room, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery drawing together. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Gossington Hall and ask Dolly Bantry's assistance in arranging a gathering, a seemingly innocent tea party to which all the principal players in this drama would be invited. There, over carefully prepared refreshments, including perhaps a recreation of Mr. Aldridge's famous fruit tart, the final truth might at last be revealed. Chapter 8. The Fruit Tart's Truth. The drawing-room at Gossington Hall had been arranged with Mrs. Bantry's customary attention to detail. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the assembled company. Miss Marple sat in a comfortable armchair near the fireplace, her knitting resting in her lap, seemingly forgotten as she observed the gathered guests with sharp, pale blue eyes. Lady Penelope Witherspoon had arrived precisely on time, her aristocratic bearing unchanged, despite the tension evident in the set of her shoulders. She sat apart from the others, a queen in exile, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Bantry with cool politeness. Mr. Graves hovered near her like a particularly anxious shadow. Edward Witherspoon stood by the window, occasionally glancing at his aunt, with an expression that combined resentment and wariness in equal measure. Professor Hargreaves sat nearby, his academic detachment somewhat undermined by the constant adjusting of his spectacles, a nervous habit, Miss Marple had observed. Flora Bennet had come directly from the bakery, bringing with her, at Miss Marple's specific request, a recreation of Mr. Aldridge's famous fruit tart, now displayed on the sideboard like an exhibit of evidence. Inspector Slack, who had initially resisted the invitation, stood near the door with the air of a man expecting trouble. "How kind of you all to come," began Mrs. Bantry brightly. "I thought it would be nice to have a little gathering in memory of poor Mr. Aldridge. Miss Marple has been helping me understand the circumstances of his passing, and she has some thoughts she'd like to share." All eyes turned to Miss Marple, who smiled gently. "I've been reflecting on the events of these past few weeks," she said, her voice soft, yet carrying clearly in the suddenly silent room. The disappearance of Mr. Aldridge's recipe at the festival, his subsequent death, and the curious interest so many people have shown in his private papers. It reminded me rather of something that happened in the village many years ago, a case of hidden identity and an inheritance that nearly went unclaimed. Lady Penelope shifted in her seat. "I fail to see what this has to do with any of us," she said coldly. "It has everything to do with Thornfield Estate," replied Miss Marple calmly, "and with a kitchen maid named Mary Briggs who worked there in 1894. A barely perceptible flinch from Lady Penelope was enough to confirm Miss Marple's suspicions. "Mary Briggs," continued Miss Marple, "who married in secret in the spring of 1895, as recorded in the parish register, on the page that was subsequently torn out. Mary Briggs, who gave birth to a daughter named Catherine Mary on June 14th of that same year." Professor Hargreaves leaned forward intently. "You have proof of this marriage? The register page is missing, as you say." "The proof," said Miss Marple, "was hidden in Mr. Aldridge's fruit tart recipe, not in the ingredients themselves, but in the measurements and preparation methods, which, when properly decoded, form dates, initials, and a location. You see, the recipe wasn't merely a family heirloom, it was a cipher, a way to preserve the truth when all other records had been destroyed. "This is preposterous," declared Lady Penelope, though her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" asked Miss Marple. "Then perhaps you can explain why your solicitor, Mr. Graves, was so interested in Mr. Aldridge's journal from 1895, or why you attended the funeral of a village baker, a man you would normally consider far beneath your notice." Edward Witherspoon's expression had changed from wariness to intense concentration. "Who was the father?" he asked quietly. "The father of Catherine Mary." Miss Marple turned to him. "William Witherspoon," she replied. "Your grandfather, Lady Penelope's father. He married Mary Briggs in secret, knowing his family would never accept a union with a servant. The marriage was legal and binding, but after Mary died in childbirth, the baby was given to a cousin of hers, a baker named Aldridge." A collective gasp went up from the assembled company. Flora's hand flew to her mouth in shock. "Mr. Aldridge was raised by his mother's cousin, never knowing his true parentage," Miss Marple continued. "It was only in later years that he began to piece together the truth, collecting evidence, researching parish records, and encoding the proof in his recipe, the one thing he knew would remain in his possession." "But that would mean," began Professor Hargreaves. "That Mr. Aldridge was the legitimate son of William Witherspoon," Miss Marple completed for him, "and as such the rightful heir to Thornfield estate. A fact which I believe he only recently discovered and shared with certain interested parties." All eyes turned to Lady Penelope, whose face had gone deathly pale. "I never knew," she whispered. "Not until Graves found letters in my father's old desk. Letters from Mary Briggs to my father, claiming they were married. I thought they were lies, attempts at blackmail." "Until Mr. Aldridge began asking questions," said Miss Marple, "and researching parish records, then you realized there might be truth to the claim after all." "It was the recipe I wanted," admitted Lady Penelope. "Graves said it contained some sort of code that could prove the marriage was real, but I never—" She looked imploringly at Inspector Slack. "I never harmed Aldridge. I may have wanted the recipe, but I didn't kill him." "No," agreed Miss Marple, her gaze moving to Mr. Graves. "You didn't, but someone else stood to lose a great deal if Mr. Aldridge's claim was proven legitimate. Someone who has handled the Witherspoon legal affairs for decades, someone who knew every secret, except perhaps this one." Mr. Graves had gone very still, his face a mask of controlled panic. "This is all conjecture," he said coldly. "You have no evidence linking me to Aldridge's death." "On the contrary," said Inspector Slack, stepping forward. "We found traces of cyanide in your office, Graves, and a witness who saw you entering the bakery late on the night Aldridge died." As Inspector Slack led a protesting Mr. Graves from the room, Miss Marple turned to Edward Witherspoon. "You suspected something of this nature, didn't you?" "It's why you returned after all these years." Edward nodded slowly. "My mother, Lady Penelope's sister, told me stories before she died. About a scandal, a servant girl, a secret that could change everything. I came back to find the truth." "And now the truth has found you," said Miss Marple gently. "Though not quite as you expected." Flora Bennet, who had been silent until now, spoke up tentatively. "What happens to the bakery, to Mr. Aldridge's papers?" Miss Marple smiled at her kindly. "I imagine that will be for Mr. Aldridge's heir to decide." All eyes turned to the fruit tart, still sitting innocently on the sideboard, a simple dessert that had concealed a family secret for over 60 years. Miss Marple rose and moved to stand beside it, her fingers tracing the delicate lattice pattern on its golden crust. "The forbidden fruit tart formula," she murmured. "Not forbidden because of its recipe, but because of the truth it revealed. The legitimate lineage that would change the inheritance of a grand estate." As the implications of the afternoon's revelation settled over the gathered company, Miss Marple reflected that human nature remained remarkably consistent regardless of social station. The desire to protect position and wealth, the lengths to which some would go to preserve their advantages, these were patterns she had observed countless times in her long life in St. Mary Mead. And yet, as she watched Edward Witherspoon step forward to examine the tart more closely, she saw in his face not triumph or greed, but a quiet wonder at this unexpected connection to a man he had barely known. Perhaps, she thought, sometimes truth could heal as well as harm, restore as well as destroy. Justice would be served both for Mr. Aldridge and for those who came before him. The recipe had fulfilled its purpose at last, not merely as instructions for creating a delicious tart, but as the key to unlocking a mystery that had waited 60 years to be solved. Thanks for joining us for the Forbidden Fruit Tart formula. If you enjoyed this Miss Marple mystery, hit subscribe for more stories every day. This is Alfie, signing off from Café Stories.